The large man gathered his things and started walking back toward his van. Another job complete. He had murdered dozens of times. This was nothing new, and he would use whatever would get the job done. It could be guns, knives, hand grenades, tire irons, ice picks, his own hands, a sidewalk, a crossbow, cyanide, and more. He was psychotic, but not your typical killer. He had a family, which was the only thing he actually cared about. We will explore his life, maybe find answers to why he became the way that he did. His name was Richard Leonard Kuklinski, and he claims he was made the way he was by his upbringing. He would freeze some of his victims after killing them to try to slow down decomposition and to throw off the time of death to investigators. This is why he was referred to as the Iceman. Richard Kuklinski was born in Jersey City on April 11, 1935, to Stanley and Anna Kuklinski. Jersey City is about a mile from Lower Manhattan in New York. Stanley had immigrated from Warsaw, Poland, and had a job as a brakeman on a bunch of different railroads. His mother worked in a meatpacking plant through much of Richard's childhood. Sometimes she would even clean the floors of a church to earn. She was brought up a strict Catholic, and she planned on becoming a nun. Shortly after joining a convent at the age of 18, she realized that kind of life was not for her, although she did continue to practice her faith. She would end up meeting Stanley at a dance sponsored by the church, and they would start dating until they eventually got married. Stanley had a mean side though, and when he drank it would come out tenfold. He would hit her and berate her and call her names like tramp and whore. Whether she wanted sex or not, Stanley would force himself on her. They would have 4 kids. From oldest to youngest, it was Florian, Richard, Roberta, and Joseph. Stanley would beat the kids for any infraction with his belt or bare hands, or sometimes he would wrap the belt around his hand and punch them. There didn't even have to be a reason for it. Richard said sometimes his father would come home and greet him by slapping him hard across the face. The beatings would be so frequent and severe that Richard would sometimes wet his pants in anticipation of a beating. When his father saw this, it would rile him up so bad he had to beat him some more. Unfortunately, oldest son Florian would die when he was only 7 years old, on February 1st, 1941. His death certificate says bronchopneumonia. Richard says that his father beat him to death, that Florian had taken one too many injuries to the head. Sister Roberta wasn't even born until 1942, so when Florian died, Richard truly was alone, like he had no one, and he was terrified. He was hoping his father would ease up after killing his other son, but he really didn't. His mother wasn't much better either. The marriage between Anna and Stanley would eventually fall apart. Stanley was so brazen he would go out, get drunk, and then bring women home to have sex with. Even Anna would not put up with that, and they would soon separate. Richard had so much hatred towards his parents, especially his father. He vowed to kill him one day. The abuse he took from his father made him numb to violence. He would look himself in the mirror as a teenager and say, "I'm not going to take a beating ever again."
Richard had a very, very sad childhood. You got the impression, or I knew because he would say something and then drop it and change the subject, that he was abused and that there was no love. He grew up absolutely without any love, without a doubt. I mean, the first Christmas with my family, he was in awe. He couldn't believe it. It was a tree, and everyone was cooking special things, and there was lots of, we were laughing, and it was fun, and he kept saying, I can't believe that this is what happens.
As far as Richard's immediate family, the only one he would have any kind of relationship was his younger brother Joseph. However, this would change when Richard would learn what kind of sick deviant Joseph actually was. Richard may have been a sociopathic killer, but he had a set of standards that he went by, a code of conduct. Richard didn't kill women or children. The kinds of people who did this were beneath him. They were the scum of the earth, especially people who molested or hurt children. Richard grew up really fast. He started driving and stealing his mom's car when he was only 13. Like typical serial killers, Richard would start by torturing and killing animals when he was young. By the time he was 16, he grew into a pretty big guy, and he was mean, and he wanted to have the idea out there that he was not someone that should be messed with. Richard became something of a pool shark, and he had made a kind of a name for himself. And he was not that 6-year-old kid that would get brutalized by his father anymore. He would sometimes get hassled and get called a Pollock at the table by some asshole. This person was lucky if they only got his head cracked open by a pool stick. He was done being disrespected, and if he wanted to hurt you, you'd be lucky to make it out alive. One night, Richard got into a verbal dispute with 3 guys that were together at the bar. Richard walked away and planned his next move. He didn't think he'd be able to take all 3 at once in the bar. He left the building and lay in wait. When they came out, he followed 2 of the 3 home. Turns out that they were brothers. Richard would go home for the time being, but he would go back to the house a couple nights later and wait for the brothers to come home. Richard got the drop on them, stabbing one of them brutally in the back. Both were caught off guard. Richard took the knife out of the first and plunged it into the stomach of the second one. They both went down, and then Richard gathered himself and walked away smoothly. There were several incidents like this. Richard claimed to have killed multiple people on several occasions that resulted from ugly verbal arguments at the bar, typically problems that would rise at the pool tables. But he wasn't just attacking and killing people he had beefs with. Richard claims he was killing random homeless people on the streets. He says he wanted to be a better killer, and he liked the idea of taking someone's life. He also saw this as practice, just like killing animals. So he would drive to Greenwich Village in New York and pick people off. He claims to have killed dozens of people this way. He says that the police thought it was homeless people killing themselves. Richard was never suspected. He always got away with it. Sometimes he used his .38 revolver, or his hunting knife, and sometimes a pipe. He was indiscriminate with his murderous ways. He didn't have much of a preference until years later, when he really liked to use cyanide. It was perfect, quick, and it was undetectable. A short while before he moved out of his mother's house, Richard came home one night to find his father Stanley beating on Mother Anna. Richard took out his .38 and immediately pulled Stanley off her. He pressed the revolver to Stanley's temple and told him through clenched teeth, "Get the fuck out of here. If you ever come back, I will kill you and dump you in the river." Stanley was taken aback. He looked in his son's eyes and knew that he meant it. And I guess Stanley did have some brains in his head. He left and he never came back. But Richard would beat himself up over the incident. He really wanted to kill Stanley for all the abuse he put him through. It would consume Richard so much in years to come that he would sometimes go to bars that he knew his father to frequent to finish him off, once and for all. But every time he went, it would happen to be on a night his father wasn't there. Richard was said to be really shy around girls despite his tough guy exterior. Despite this, Richard would meet a girl named Linda who was 25. Richard was only 16. Richard was very inexperienced, but they would still have a lot of sex. They would end up moving in together, marrying and having 2 children. But the relationship did not last, and Richard left. He really didn't have much to do with his first wife or his children after that. However, Richard did see Linda as his property, and when brother Joseph told him Linda was having an affair in a hotel room, Richard saw blind rage. He went straight to the hotel and kicked the door in. He caught them in the middle of having sex. He jumped on the guy and then stopped the daylights out of him. After breaking several bones, he turned his attention towards Linda. He threatened to kill her if she cheated again. He knocked her out cold and then proceeded to slice her nipples off. And that would be the end of Richard Kuklinski's first serious relationship. His next serious relationship worth noting would be to Barbara Pedrisi, which would be his next wife and mother of his next 3 children. Unlike his first marriage, he would be an active participant in their lives, but it would be far from normal. He met Barbara in 1961. She was only 18, he 26. In Richard's early 20s, he claimed he was working for the DeKalb, New Jersey crime family. His task would be to collect money, run packages, and even commit murder. But in 1961, he was offered a good-paying job at a trucking company by a friend of his. Richard was a little reluctant about working a straight job, but it was here that he met Barbara. Richard didn't even really know how to talk to her at first, but they would greet each other by the vending machine or whatnot. Not long after meeting, they made plans to go out. Richard saw Barbara as a good girl, and he loved that about her. Barbara was a virgin, and Richard wanted a respectable woman he could settle down with. Barbara didn't know what to make of their relationship at first. She was young. She liked Rich. He was a good-looking, sweet older guy. She wasn't used to all this attention. Richard started spending all his time with Barbara, and he wouldn't even ask her. He would just show up at her house with long-stem flowers, and he was whisking her away the next thing she knew. At first, Barbara was flattered, but after a while she felt she needed to take a step back and breathe. She was starting to feel smothered, like she was trapped. She wasn't able to spend time with her friends anymore. All of her time had to go towards him, and she finally sat him down one day to confront him about it. They were parked in his car, and she unleashed feelings that she was feeling trapped, and that they shouldn't spend so much time together, and that it might be a good idea to see other people. Just as she said the last part, she felt a sharp pain on her left shoulder. Richard had stabbed her. He told her that she is never to leave him, and that he would kill her and her family if she ever tried to. Barbara was mortified. She hadn't seen this side of Richard before, but she would later say that there were two Richards, good Richard and bad Richard. In years to come, when he would come home from a long day at work, you could tell from the tone in his voice, and if you heard a clicking sound in his teeth, bad Richard was there today. And if he was, you better avoid him. Bad Richard could throw around and break furniture, TVs, windows. He could beat Barbara for little to no reason. He would give her black eyes, bloody noses, and broken ribs. The Kuklinskis would have two daughters, Merrick and Chris, and son Dwayne. Richard never laid a hand on any of his kids. That was one thing he wouldn't do. He didn't want to be like his father Stanley in that regard. But he had no qualms in beating his wife Barbara in front of his daughters, which had everlasting terrible effects on them. Youngest child Dwayne was shielded from witnessing the physical abuse. Barbara was afraid that Dwayne might try to step in when he got older to defend her, and one of these alpha males might not make it out alive. So Dwayne was kept at Barbara's mother's house quite a bit, but Dwayne would figure out the abuse that unfolded at the house. How else would his mother have so many bruises and furniture be broken? Despite the abuse the kids witnessed, daughter Merrick would always be forgiving of her father. They seemed to have a special bond Richard didn't have with the other kids. Didn't mean that Merrick wasn't afraid of him, though. Richard would tell Merrick on more than one occasion that if he ever ended up killing her mother in a rage, that he would have to kill her and the other kids as well. And Merrick would just nod along and say, "I know, Daddy." Because of this exchange, Chris and Merrick would have an escape bag packed and ready to go in case they ever had to leave at a moment's notice. Richard and Barbara would try to have a nice family, despite their toxic relationship. Richard would work at a film lab early in the marriage, but it was hard for Richard to be completely straight. He started pirating porno movies illegally to make money on the side. He felt that he had to. He wasn't making enough money to cover all the bills. This would upset him so bad he would take it out on Barbara. Richard's younger brother Joe was also causing him great stress. Richard had found out that Joe was gay, or rather bisexual. After some time, Richard was able to warm up to the idea. This was his brother, so he chose to accept his lifestyle, not judge him. But not long after Richard accepted Joe, Joe kept calling upon Richard to bail him out of trouble. It usually had to do with money that Joe owed someone, whether it was money he borrowed or lost in a bet. But Richard finally told him, "Look, I have a family. I can't keep bailing you out." The next Richard heard about his brother was a truly despicable incident. Joe had raped a 12-year-old girl named Pamela Dial while he was drunk. They were neighbors. Joe lured her onto the roof of their apartment building where he forced himself on her. Afterwards, he would throw her and her dog off the roof. They would both be killed. And Joe was facing capital murder charges, which means he could face the death penalty. Richard thought it was a mistake at first until Joe admitted it to him. When Richard asked why, Joe said, "Because she wanted it." Richard never spoke to his brother again after that. Richard would continue to pirate his porn movies at the lab, but he wanted to earn more. A couple of connected guys he knew offered to front him some money. He started to work on a consignment deal as a wholesaler and started making a ton of money. He would pay some money back to the backers, but it was never the amount that they expected or asked for. Richard was always shorting them, and Richard couldn't be bullied. Richard was the bully. One of the backers named Chris Rosenthal ran to get help from their boss, a man named Roy DeMayo. Roy ran a murder crew out of a bar called the Gemini Lounge, also known as the Slaughterhouse. Roy and his murder crew were unsavory fellas that you didn't want to mess with, to say the least. They were connected murder-for-hire guys from the Gambino crime family, and they worked for Nino Gaggi. They were professional killers who knew how to dispose of bodies. And Roy was a huge muscular guy and one mean son of a bitch. He ended up going to Richard to collect the money owed. Richard did not respond favorably at first, and Roy pistol whipped him. Despite this exchange, Richard paid Roy, and they ended up being on friendly terms and partners, at least for the time being. But in the back of Richard's mind, he's thinking he's going to kill them over this transgression. Nobody treats him that way. In addition to producing porn movies to make money on, Roy begins to offer a lot of murder contracts that Richard can work on. Also, Richard is turned on to other crime ventures, including hijacking trucks and collecting debts. But in collecting debts, Richard will usually have to kill if they don't pay up. From here, Richard is making a ton of money. Sometimes $20,000 a hit, sometimes $50,000 a hit, sometimes more. And when Richard has money, he's going to spend it. He takes his wife to lavish restaurants. He takes the family on expensive vacations, and it's nothing for him to dish out $100 bills. He has it made, and so the killings continue. And Richard never has any problems with them. Sometimes he is told by the customer that he needs to torture the victim. Richard claims that there were multiple times where he would bring the victim to a cave in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, tie him up, cut him open, and leave a camera running. Richard says that rats would eat the bodies until there was nothing left. However, there is debate whether this story is true, and no videotapes have actually surfaced. Richard continued to pull out hits for Roy DeMayo, and he would always carry the hits out alone, which is how he preferred it. If Roy made Richard work with his crew, it could definitely lead to problems. Fortunately, it didn't come to that. Richard was always trying to find more efficient and crafty ways to kill someone. How Richard came about using cyanide would be through a friend that he would meet, a truly sick and twisted individual named Robert Prong. Richard thought he had seen the most dangerous guy when he met Roy DeMayo. But there would be something about this Robert Prong that would seem much more darker than DeMayo, and sinister. The way that they met was very unusual. Richard was casing an apartment of a mark he was looking to kill. He was doing a job for the DeCavalcante family, and he had been staking out the place for 11 days. During the stakeout, he kept seeing and running into Prong. It got to happen so often that Richard finally confronted him. Richard thought this guy was following him, and the guy thought that Richard was following him. You can imagine their surprise when they both realized they were tailing two different men that they were trying to kill. Prong would invite Richard into his truck, which was actually a Mr. Softee ice cream truck. Richard was very impressed with the Mr. Softee idea. No one would suspect the ice cream peddler was a cold-blooded murderer.
Kuklinski was always looking for new ways to get away with murder. In the 80s, a man who was nicknamed Mr. Softee teamed up with Kuklinski. This harmless-looking ice cream vendor was in reality an Army-trained demolitions expert who was a violent and vicious killer.
Mr. Softee was an individual by the name of Robert Pronge. He used to operate a Mr. Softee truck. That's why he got the name Mr. Softee. He became friendly with Kuklinski, very friendly with him, and it is our opinion that friendship led to Richard Kuklinski learning a lot about killing with different types of chemicals, including cyanide.
He taught me a lot, basically, but he was extremely crazy. But he would read all kinds of books on destruction and all kinds of ways to destroy somebody. He used to go around this Mr. Softee truck. That's how he used to spot people and get the outlay of the land, you know, where they were and easy ways. And sometimes he'd do it right from the truck.
And he sold ice cream?
Yes, he did. Sold Mr. Softee.
Mr. Softee started telling Richard how he would kill people with grenades under their cars. But it was poison that really got Richard's attention. He would mix cyanide with the methyl sulfoxide and contain it in a spray bottle. If someone breathed it in, they would be done in a matter of seconds. Prong would demonstrate it on a cat, which showed its effectiveness as the cat went down. Prong was ex-Special Forces and he was angry at the world. He spent all his time coming up with different tactical ways of murdering people. This was all that consumed his mind, and he had no problem killing women and children. He didn't bat an eye at that idea. But this was where Richard would draw the line. But in any case, Richard felt like they were friends, and he was learning a lot from this guy. Richard would tag along when Prong went on a job. Prong had been tailing a mark for a while and knew his routine, and when he would be getting home each night. If it was windy, they would have to postpone this hit. Fortunately, the air was calm that day. Prong walked up to the guy's car as he pulled in his driveway. The mark stepped out and Prong held his breath as he sprayed cyanide in his face. Richard watched on. The mark fell to the ground and died. Prong quietly and calmly walked back to his car and they took off, with no witnesses. And then Richard would go back to spend time with his family, as if he weren't a part of such brutal atrocities. And every Sunday Richard would be in church and he would act as an usher. He merely did this for his family. He firmly believed the church was full of lying, hypocritical people. And these same priests would be at peep shows that Richard sold his pirated videos to.
Kuklinski kept his criminal life secret from his family and neighbors. He told them he was a businessman. No one knew his business was murder.
We were perfect. My children were never in trouble. We were perfect. We were the all-American family. I mean, we had what seemed to be the perfect life. There were wonderful times. And time with his family was the only thing that he was really concerned. I mean, if he never had to leave the house, he would have loved it. He hated to have to travel. He hated to go away. He came back as soon as he can. He wanted to be home all the time. He wanted to be with us all the time.
I enjoyed that way of life. I felt I had achieved something. I very seldom left the house unless I had to, because I felt secure in the house. I felt very secure. I tried to provide the best for them as I knew how. Might not have been the right way to go, but it was for me the only way.
Richard had been using animal tranquilizers to stun his marks. He took Prong along on one of his jobs and they kidnapped the mark from a grocery lot after Richard hit the guy with a dart. This was to be a torture kill according to Richard's customer, so he'd be taking the victim up to the caves to have rats eat him alive. It was to be videotaped to show the customer. When Prong learned of the way Richard would savagely end this man, he thought it was the most excellent thing he ever saw. The two men would continue to learn from each other. Prong would sometimes freeze bodies in his truck. He figured this would slow down decomposition of the body. Things would come to a head between Richard and Prong, though, when Prong asked Richard to kill his wife and his 8-year-old son. Richard refused the job because, as stated before, that was one thing that he was not willing to do. In addition to this, on a separate job, Prong was planning on poisoning a reservoir with ricin to target one particular family. But if he went along with this, hundreds of other people would also be killed, including hundreds of innocent women and children. Richard couldn't allow that to happen, and one night Richard would sneak up behind Prong in his ice cream truck and shot him with a .22 caliber 5 times. Richard had a friend named Phil Salamine. It was one of Richard's only friends, and they did illegal business together. Phil had a store with illegal items he sold, and this is who Richard would go to after his truck hijackings. It was through Phil that Richard would start to meet a lot of different men that Richard started killing, and this would lead to Richard's downfall and finally his arrest. Richard first met George Malaban at Phil's shop. The man was heavy-set, a bad gambler, and kind of loud and obnoxious. There was definitely a lot of times he should have kept his mouth shut. Richard and George were somewhat friendly. They each had spent time at the other's house on occasion. Richard was in the awkward situation of collecting on a bad debt from George. Richard had been sent by Roy to get the money, and George would come up with nothing but excuses. George made the mistake of saying to Richard, "Remember, big guy, I know where you live, where your family lives. You won't let anything happen to me." Besides blood, that would be the last thing to come out of George's mouth. They were driving at the time. Richard would pull the car to the side of the road to shoot George 5 times in the face. Shortly later, Richard would hack up the body and stuff him into a 55-gallon drum. Richard didn't take precautions with disposing of this body, and George would soon be found. And George's brother would tell the police the last person George was going to meet was Richard Kuklinski. Richard would claim that he killed a dirty cop named Peter Calabro. He says that the order did not only come from Roy DeMeo, but also notorious Gambino crime figure Sammy the Bull Gravano. Calabro had gotten himself into some hot water, and it was suspected he might talk and give up DeMeo and Gravano. Another man that Richard met through Phil was named Louis Masgay, who would purchase a lot of merchandise from Phil. Phil and Richard would end up setting this guy up. Masgay knew that Richard was a hijacker, and sometimes they would get blank videotapes, and this became all that Masgay was interested in purchasing. He kept asking both Richard and Phil if they would have any blank tapes, and he was willing to spend a lot of cash. Finally, one day Phil told him he had a truckload. Masgay went and came back with $90,000. Before he had returned, Phil put out a call to Richard, telling him what was going down. Richard came and blew Masgay's head off. Him and Phil would split the money. Then Richard would go and freeze the body. Richard would be part of a breaking and entering crew that burgled houses all over New Jersey. They would sell what they could to Phil, who would in turn sell it to his customers. The men that were a part of the B&E crew were Al Rink, Gary Smith, Danny Deppner, and Percy House. Phil actually owed money to the ringleader Percy House. Instead of paying, Phil threatened him and said that Richard killed George Malaban and Louis Masgay, and that if he didn't back off, he's going to get Richard to kill him too. Things started to get even worse for the B&E crew when one of the members, Al Rink, got busted for burglary, and then he turned into foreman. He gave up the rest of the crew, which led to a 153-count indictment. Percy House got picked up first, but the rest went into hiding and were doing a pretty good job of staying low. Percy wasn't talking at first, though. He was terrified of Richard. Richard put up Gary Smith and Danny Deppner in a motel room and told them that they are not to go anywhere. Richard was the boss, and they had to listen to him or the penalties would be catastrophic for them. Gary didn't listen, though, and he went to visit his daughter at one point. Richard got wind of this, and that was the end of Gary. Richard would end up poisoning Gary's hamburger with cyanide. Gary wouldn't die right away, and Richard made Deppner strangle him with a lamp wire. Then, in a fit of carelessness, him and Deppner hid the body under the motel's bed mattress. The body would sit there rotting, as the room was turned over a total of 12 times to different guests, before the body was finally discovered.
The body was found in a decomposed state. It was very hot weather. Smith would have not been identified as a murder victim if he had died only of the cyanide. If the cyanide had worked and he had died and he didn't need to be strangled, that ligature mark around the neck wouldn't have been seen, and he would have been possibly a drug addict overdose, or lots of other things of a non-homicidal nature would have to be considered.
Danny Deppner was the last one from the B&E crew still alive. They hadn't been picked up by the cops yet, but his good fortune wouldn't last forever. Deppner sealed his own fate when he told his ex-wife Barbara how him and Richard murdered Gary, and Barbara would start spilling the beans to law enforcement of everything she knew. 2 weeks after Gary was killed, Richard handed Debner a roast beef sandwich that he picked up for lunch, but not before he sprinkled some cyanide on it. As Debner was feeling the effects, Richard took his .22 with the silencer on it and shot him in the head. Later on, Richard employed the help of daughter Merrick's boyfriend to get rid of the body. Richard couldn't do it alone due to back problems. He told Merrick's boyfriend it was due to a drug overdose. It is unclear whether he actually believed that, and if he saw the bullet wound in the head. Paul Hoffman was another shady character that Richard met through his friend Phil years earlier. Paul was a sketchy pharmacist that would provide Richard with poisons over the years that he would use on his victims, and Phil and Richard would usually have supplies of different things that Paul was interested in. This particular time it was the drug Tagamet.
The case of Paul Hoffman was typical of the way he operated. On the afternoon of April 29, 1982, Hoffman arrived at a warehouse leased by Kuklinski. Like numerous victims of the Iceman, he had been set up for a phony business deal.
Paul Hoffman was a pharmacist, and he was looking for a quick buck. He was out to purchase a drug called Tagamet, which was at the time a wonder drug for ulcers. And he felt that if he could purchase a large quantity of this Tagamet at a very low price, that he could indeed make a huge profit on that. And that was the alleged deal that he had with Richard Kuklinski.
When Paul Hoffman showed up to buy the Tagamet, he was carrying $25,000 in cash.
He took the bag, door opened it, showed me a whole mess of money, a whole mess of cash. He said, "Look, I got the money right here." And he came back. He says, "What are we going to do? What are we going to do? How am I going to get this merchandise?" I put the gun under his chin, and I said, "There is no merchandise." And I shot him. He didn't die. The gun jammed. He was gurgling. I had hit him. It was, blood was pouring out of his mouth. And, he was in I would imagine it looked like he was in a lot of pain. So there was a tire iron there. I took the tire iron and hit him with it, which knocked him out. And he died. I then took him and put him in a 50-gallon drum.
Detective Pat Kane would be the one who ultimately set up Operation Iceman and bring down Richard Kuklinski. He had heard about Big Rich, or the Polak, as others would refer to him on the street. Kane started getting information about Richard from informants. When Danny Deppner's ex-wife Barbara spoke of Richard, she would constantly call him the devil with terror in her eyes. Who the hell was this guy? Kane learned that Richard was a family man. He was liked by his neighbors, who would actually barbecue with him on occasion. But this seemingly normal family man looked like he might be a murderer and a monster. Many other detectives were skeptical about Richard being the psychotic killer. But then Percy House started talking. He told the detectives that Richard was responsible for killing George Malaban, Gary Smith, and Danny Deppner, and he had gotten this information from his brother-in-law, who was actually Phil Salamine. The evidence against Richard was largely circumstantial, and the word of degenerate criminals. They decided not to arrest Richard at that time. The New Jersey Crime Task Force was trying to decide the best tactic to obtain information from the suspect. They decided to use an ATF agent named Dominic Polifrone, an Italian who was a smart street guy. He would go undercover to try to get information out of Richard, but this would be a lengthy process. Phil Salamine ended up getting picked up by the police. His son had been turned in by Percy House for burglary and was looking at some hard time. The New Jersey Crime Task Force told him he was going to help them, and in return they would see about getting his son out of trouble. The way to help them was to invite Dominic into his circle. Dominic would go under the name Dominic Provenzano. From there, Dom could get to know Richard while hanging out with connected guys, playing card games, and just being a part of that inner circle. Richard didn't trust a lot of people, and so this would be an 18-month ordeal before Richard and Dom started to get close, and Richard started incriminating himself on wiretaps. Richard had killed his two sources of cyanide, Robert Pronge and Paul Hoffman, and he needed a new provider, and that's where Dominic would be of use. So now Dominic Provenzano would step in to be Richard's cyanide guy.
Undercover federal agent Dominic Polifrone, who was able to win Mr. Kuklinski's confidence and was able to record conversations where he detailed his participation in these murders.
I portrayed myself as a hitman. Told him I worked for the wise guys downtown New York, and my brother was a good fella downtown, and I went by the name of Dominic Michael Provenzano.
You willing to go out on a contract? If the price is right, I'll talk to anybody. Yeah? Sure. And you mean to tell me your way is nice and clean and nothing fucking shows up? Well, it may show, my friend, but it's quiet. It's not messy. It's not noisy. It's not, you know. Yeah, but how the fuck do you put it together, like, you know what I'm saying? Oh, there's always a way. There's a will, there's a way, my friend.
We used to sit down, we'd talk. Either we'd go to those tables over there and get away from people, and we discuss how to murder people.
You know, I just have a few problems I want to dispose of. I have some rats I want to get rid of. Yeah. The only fucking thing I don't understand, don't you use a fucking piece of iron to get rid of these fucking people? You use this fucking cyanide? Why be messy? You can do it nice and calm.
It became apparent at later points in the investigation that Mr. Kuklinski fully intended on murdering Dominic Polifrone, in addition to the victims that were being discussed at the time they were having these tape-recorded conversations. So he could pretty much tell Dominic Polifrone anything, because he knew shortly that he had plans for Mr. Polifrone too.
You put that stuff in a mist, you spray it in somebody's face, and they go to sleep. No shit. As long as he's dead, that's the bottom line. Well, that's the thing, isn't it? No matter how it was done, I mean, I know guys that went to sleep and never woke up again. I mean, you know.
He says he had one guy, he went and get a hamburger, they come back and he put the cyanide on his hamburger. And we're sitting down and he's telling me, he says, you wouldn't believe it. He says, I'm waiting for this guy to keel over. He says, because once you eat cyanide, usually you'd roll over and that's it. He says, this guy had the constitution of a fucking bull. He says, you wouldn't believe it. He says he wouldn't die, and we're both laughing about this. And I'm saying in the back of my mind, I said, holy God. I said, look at this. I said, what kind of person is this? I said to myself right there, I said, you better cover your butt. I said, because you just don't know with this guy. And he'd be kidding about it, and I'd be laughing. In the back of my mind, I'm saying, this is the devil. No question about it, this is the devil.
On December 17, 1986, the Special Task Force set up a roadblock and arrested Richard Kuklinski outside his home in Dumont, New Jersey. They felt they had all the evidence they needed for a conviction.
The whole road was blocked off with cops. Local police, state police, Division of Criminal Justice investigators, county personnel. There was no place for him to go. So he stopped his car. He was told to get out of the car, and he did not. So he was taken out of the car, and he was placed face down on a street in a position where we thought we were safe. And then I handcuffed him. That guy's big. I did everything I could to get one click on the handcuffs. And later on, I tried to put leg irons on him, and there's no way they would go on. They just wouldn't go on.
Law enforcement authorities have arrested one of the most notorious contract killers in state history. A self-employed Bergen County man is behind bars, charged with 5 murders, and prosecutors are investigating his involvement in dozens more.
This is unwarranted, unnecessary. These guys watch too many movies.
He is such a cold-blooded killer, they call him the Iceman. After being convicted of 2 murders, he confessed to 2 others in court today.
I shot George Malaban 5 times. Louis Masgay on July 1st, 1981. I shot him once in the back of the head.
When the judge asked him why he had killed the 2 men, Kuklinski replied,
It was due to business.
Dominic Polifrone's tapes had nailed Kuklinski, but in court, the Iceman greeted the undercover cop with a smile.
He seemed to be quite cheery about saying hello to you.
Well, I reciprocated. The only thing is, I'm going home, and he's going to a different environment at the present time.